Why Patton was the only general the Germans truly feared. Before the first American tank ever clashed with German armor in Western Europe, before U.S. infantry learned what it meant to face seasoned Wehrmacht veterans, one name had already traveled across enemy maps, intelligence files, and whispered conversations inside German headquarters. It was not Eisenhower. It was not Bradley. It was not Montgomery. The name that unsettled German planners long before D-Day was George Smith Patton, Jr. In Berlin, war rooms were quiet places. They were not filled with shouting or theatrical speeches. They were filled with calculations, probabilities, and cold assessments of threat. German officers did not waste fear. Fear was reserved only for opponents who demonstrated something unpredictable, relentless, and dangerous. And by late 1942, Patton's name was underlined in German intelligence reports for exactly that reason. The German High Command initially viewed the United States Army with skepticism. Many senior officers believed American soldiers were poorly trained, over-equipped, and psychologically soft. They believed American generals were administrators, not warriors, men who relied on numbers and industry rather than instinct and aggression. Early U.S. failures only reinforced this belief. When American forces stumbled in North Africa in 1942, German commanders felt validated. They believed the Americans would fight cautiously, retreat when pressed, and require British leadership to function effectively. Then Patton arrived. His entry into the war was not subtle. It was not diplomatic. It was not gentle. And from the moment he took command, the tone of American operations changed so sharply that German intelligence officers began reassessing everything they thought they knew about the United States Army. German fear of Patton did not begin with his victories. It began with his tempo. The Wehrmacht had spent years perfecting blitzkrieg speed, shock, and psychological dominance. German commanders were trained to exploit hesitation. They expected Allied generals to pause, consolidate, and wait for perfect conditions. Patton did none of that. He attacked when maps were incomplete. He advanced when flanks were uncertain. He exploited momentum without waiting for permission. And to German officers trained to read patterns, this behavior was deeply disturbing. In North Africa, German field reports began to change tone. Instead of describing American forces, they began referencing Patton's forces. Distinction mattered. German intelligence understood that armies take on the personality of their commanders, and Patton's personality was aggressive, confrontational, and utterly uninterested in defensive warfare. What truly unsettled German officers was Patton's refusal to behave like what they believed an American general should be. He did not wait to be tested. He did not probe cautiously. He did not rely on British direction. He pushed forward with confidence that bordered on arrogance and sometimes crossed into it. But arrogance, when backed by speed and violence of action, becomes something else entirely. It becomes intimidation. German officers were students of military psychology. They understood morale, shock, and command presence. And Patton projected all three with alarming clarity. He was loud. He was theatrical. He was visible. He wore polished helmets, riding crops, and revolvers not because he needed them, but because he wanted to be seen. German intelligence quickly understood. This was not vanity alone, it was psychological warfare. Patton wanted the enemy to know who was coming. Captured German documents later revealed that Patton was discussed as an offensive-minded commander with dangerous independence. In German military culture, independence without discipline was weakness. But independence combined with aggression was something else. It was a wild variable. And wild variables were the hardest to plan against. Unlike other Allied generals, Patton did not conceal his intentions through silence. He concealed them through misdirection. He spoke loudly about attacking here, advancing there, striking immediately, and then did something entirely different at the last moment. German officers learned quickly that Patton's words could not be trusted, but his movements demanded attention. This forced German planners into an uncomfortable position. To ignore Patton risked catastrophe. To focus too heavily on him risked missing other threats. This dilemma followed German intelligence throughout the war. Even before American forces had proven themselves tactically equal to German veterans, Patton had proven himself psychologically dangerous. One German officer later admitted that Patton was not feared because he was American, but feared because he behaved like one of us, without our limits. That sentence reveals more than praise. It reveals recognition. The Germans did not fear American numbers. They feared American unpredictability when paired with Patton's mindset. Patton studied German warfare obsessively. He read their manuals. He analyzed Rommel's campaigns. He understood how German commanders thought because he thought like them, but with fewer restrictions. German generals noticed this quickly. They saw an enemy who anticipated reactions rather than merely responding. This anticipation became Patton's signature. He did not wait for German mistakes. He forced them. German field commanders began requesting reinforcements when Patton's units appeared on maps, not because they were losing immediately, but because they knew the pressure would escalate. Patton did not allow pauses. He did not allow the enemy time to reorganize psychologically. He attacked their confidence as much as their positions. German fear was not rooted in a single battle. It was rooted in a pattern. Patton attacked faster than expected. He exploited success more aggressively than doctrine suggested. He punished retreat mercilessly, and he did not apologize for casualties inflicted on the enemy. To German commanders used to fighting cautious Allied generals, Patton felt uncomfortably familiar, like facing a mirror that moved faster. The German High Command also feared Patton's relationship with his soldiers. While his discipline was harsh and his expectations unforgiving, German intelligence observed that American troops under Patton advanced with confidence. They moved as if they believed they were supposed to win. This psychological posture mattered deeply to German planners who understood morale as a battlefield weapon. Patton did not inspire obedience alone. He inspired belief, and belief is contagious. As the war progressed, German intelligence began ranking Allied commanders by threat level. Eisenhower was respected as a coordinator. Bradley was seen as competent but cautious. Montgomery was viewed as methodical and slow. Patton, however, was categorized separately as a commander who created chaos simply by existing. German generals did not always agree with one another, but when it came to Patton, there was consensus on one point. If Patton was involved, expect speed, expect aggression, and expect no relief once contact was made. This reputation traveled ahead of him like artillery fire before the guns were visible. By the time the Allies began planning for operations in Western Europe, Patton's name was already influencing German deployments, even when he was not present. Entire defensive plans were adjusted because of where German intelligence believed Patton might be. That fear would soon be exploited on a scale few generals in history ever achieved. But before Patton became the phantom threat that haunted German planning before D-Day, he first had to prove something far more dangerous than tactical brilliance. He had to prove that fear itself could be weaponized. And that story, how Patton became not just a general, but a psychological force, is where the Germans' true fear truly began. German officers were trained to recognize patterns. War to them was not chaos, it was behavior. Commanders revealed themselves through rhythm, caution, and repetition. Once you understood how a general thought, you could predict where he would hesitate, when he would consolidate, and how long he would pause before committing fully. This method had worked against the French, the British, and now they believed it would work against the Americans. George Patton shattered that belief in Sicily. When Allied forces landed in Sicily in July 1943, German commanders initially assessed the operation as familiar. The Americans, they believed, would advance carefully inland, while the British bore the main burden. They expected slow coordination, defensive pauses, and political caution. For the first days, events seemed to confirm this expectation. Then Patton did something the Germans did not anticipate. He ignored the script. Patton did not accept his role as a secondary commander. He did not wait for permission to exploit opportunity. When German and Italian defenses showed cracks, Patton drove directly into them with speed that stunned enemy planners. He advanced not as a cautious occupier, but as a predator exploiting weakness before it could recover. German field reports from Sicily reveal confusion. Units reported American armor appearing where intelligence had said it should not be. German officers complained of unpredictable American movement, a phrase that had not appeared in earlier assessments. The Americans were supposed to be learning. Instead, under Patton, they were improvising aggressively. What frightened German commanders was not Patton's aggression alone. It was his disregard for pauses. German doctrine assumed that after a breakthrough, Allied units would halt to reorganize. Patton did the opposite. He pushed harder. He extended supply lines dangerously. He accepted risk that German commanders believed no rational American general would take. But Patton understood something. German planners underestimated momentum itself was a weapon. In Sicily, Patton raised his forces across the island not simply to capture territory, but to deny the enemy time to think. German units retreating under pressure found themselves repeatedly cut off, flanked, or forced into hurried withdrawals. These were not catastrophic defeats, but they were psychologically draining. Every hour Patton denied them increased uncertainty. German intelligence officers began noting Patton's name with concern, not because he was tactically flawless. He was not, but because he refused to behave predictably. Mistakes could be exploited. Unpredictability could not. Even more troubling was Patton's understanding of German pride. Patton deliberately humiliated enemy forces by moving faster than they thought possible. He took cities not because they were strategically essential, but because they symbolized dominance. When Patton entered Palermo ahead of British forces, it was not just a territorial victory, it was a psychological message. He was not competing with allies. He was announcing himself to the enemy. German commanders noticed. Captured German correspondents later revealed frustration that Patton fights as if the rules do not apply to him. To German officers raised on discipline and hierarchy, this behavior felt dangerous, not reckless, but intentionally destabilizing. Patton's forces also displayed something German intelligence did not expect from Americans: confidence under fire. German officers had believed American troops would retreat when pressed hard. Instead, Patton's men attacked into pressure. They advanced through resistance rather than maneuvering around it. This was not standard American behavior. It was Patton's influence. German commanders understood that troops reflect their leader. If Patton was willing to take risks, his soldiers followed. That willingness changed battlefield calculations. German units could no longer rely on intimidation alone. They could no longer assume Americans would disengage when casualties mounted. Patton had altered the psychological equation. The fear deepened when German intelligence began comparing Patton to their own aggressive commanders. Some described him as an American, Rommel with fewer restraints. This comparison was not made lightly. Rommel was respected not just for his skill, but for his audacity. To place Patton in the same mental category meant recognizing him as a genuine battlefield threat. But Patton was not merely aggressive, he was observant. He studied German withdrawals and recognized patterns in how they disengaged. He attacked supply nodes when possible, pressured rear guards relentlessly, and forced German commanders to commit reserves earlier than planned. This created a sense of constant crisis. German units felt hunted rather than opposed. What truly alarmed German planners was Patton's tempo control. Most generals reacted to events. Patton created them. German commanders found themselves responding to Patton rather than shaping the battlefield themselves. This reversal of initiative was deeply unsettling to officers trained to dominate tempo. By the end of the Sicilian campaign, German assessments of the American army had changed, but only partially. They still believed many American generals were cautious. But Patton was now listed as an exception, a dangerous one. German intelligence reports began recommending defensive adjustments whenever Patton's units were identified. More reserves, stronger rear security, earlier withdrawals. All of this required resources, and resources were limited. Patton forced the Germans to spend energy worrying about him. Fear in war is not panic. It is distraction. Patton became a distraction the Germans could not afford, yet could not ignore. Even when Patton was removed from public command after the Sicily incidents, German intelligence did not relax. They assumed, correctly, that Patton would return, and when he did, they feared it would be worse. Commanders like Patton did not learn restraint from humiliation. They learned patience. By late 1943, German officers believed they understood Allied leadership styles. Eisenhower coordinated. Bradley measured. Montgomery prepared endlessly. But Patton attacked instinctively, violently, and without apology. He represented the kind of commander German doctrine had been built to produce, but now faced across the battlefield. And this recognition terrified them, because if America produced more men like Patton, the war's balance would shift permanently. The Germans did not yet know how deeply. Patton's reputation would soon be exploited, not with tanks, but with illusion. That reckoning would come before D-Day, and when it did, Patton would terrify the Germans without firing a single shot. By early 1944, German intelligence no longer debated whether George S. Patton was dangerous. That question had been settled in Sicily. The new question was far more unsettling. Where would Patton strike next? To the German High Command, Patton was not simply another Allied general. He had become a symbol of American unpredictability. German planners believed that wherever Patton appeared, speed followed, and wherever speed followed, collapse was never far behind. His absence from the front did not calm them. It unnerved them, because Patton was never truly absent. German intelligence tracked Allied commanders obsessively. They studied radio traffic, troop movements, even rumors circulating among civilians. When Patton vanished from battlefield reports in late 1943, suspicion grew. Aggressive commanders did not simply disappear. They were being prepared. This belief became an obsession. German analysts concluded that the Allies would not waste Patton on secondary operations. He would be used for the decisive blow, the invasion of Western Europe itself. In German logic, Patton was the spearhead, not the shield. Hitler agreed. Hitler's fixation on Patton was personal and ideological. He respected aggression and despised hesitation. In Patton, Hitler saw a reflection of the kind of commander Germany once celebrated: relentless, theatrical, ruthless in pursuit of victory. Hitler believed such men were rare and therefore decisive. This belief hardened German expectations. By early 1944, German defensive planning increasingly revolved around Patton's potential movements. The Germans believed Patton would command the main invasion force, and that it would strike where Germany was weakest but most vital. That place in their minds was Pas-de-Calais. Pas-de-Calais was the shortest route across the English Channel. It offered direct access to Germany's industrial heartland. German defenses there were strong but not impenetrable. German logic insisted that a commander like Patton would favor speed and directness over surprise, and so the Germans waited. What they did not realize was that Patton had become something more dangerous than a general. He had become a myth. The Allies understood German fear. They understood German logic, and they decided to weaponize it. Operation Fortitude was not merely deception. It was psychological warfare built around Patton's reputation. Fake armies were created on paper. Inflatable tanks were positioned where German reconnaissance could see them. Radio traffic was carefully scripted. Entire divisions existed only in whispers and shadows, and at the center of it all stood Patton. Patton was placed in command of a fictional force, the First U.S. Army Group. On paper, it was massive. On maps, it was poised. In German intelligence reports, it was terrifying. German analysts tracked its supposed movements daily, convinced Patton was preparing the decisive strike. Patton played his role perfectly. He made public appearances. He was seen inspecting troops. He traveled conspicuously. He allowed himself to be noticed. Every sighting reinforced German assumptions. Patton was restless. Patton was preparing. Patton was coming. Meanwhile, the real invasion force assembled elsewhere. Even as Allied troops prepared to land in Normandy, German commanders hesitated. They feared committing reserves too early. What if Normandy was a diversion? What if Patton was waiting across the Channel, ready to strike Pas-de-Calais once German defenses shifted? This hesitation would prove catastrophic. On June 6, 1944, when Allied forces landed in Normandy, German commanders responded, but cautiously. They believed the real blow had not yet fallen. Reports poured in from the coast, but German high command restrained armored reserves. Patton had not moved. To them that meant everything. German intelligence continued to insist that Patton's army remained intact and poised. Even as days passed, Hitler refused to release key divisions. He believed Patton was waiting for the perfect moment, and Patton, still officially commanding a phantom army, waited in silence. This delay cost Germany precious time. Allied forces consolidated their beachheads. Supplies poured in. Defensive lines that might have been broken early were now reinforced by Allied strength. The opportunity to throw the Allies back into the sea slipped away, not through battlefield defeat, but through fear. Fear of Patton. German commanders later admitted that Patton's reputation paralyzed decision-making. They feared being outmaneuvered more than being overwhelmed. They feared committing forces in the wrong place more than losing territory temporarily. Patton had done what no artillery barrage could achieve. He had frozen the enemy's will, even after it became clear that Normandy was the main invasion. German leaders hesitated to fully abandon Pas-de-Calais. They believed Patton would still come. For weeks, divisions remained tied down, guarding against a threat that did not exist except in memory. When Patton finally returned to active combat command in France, German officers were not relieved. They were resigned. They knew now that the man they had feared for months was real and no longer constrained by illusion. When Patton's Third Army exploded across France in the summer of 1944, German commanders felt confirmation of their worst fears. This was the speed they had anticipated. This was the aggression they had dreaded. Patton moved faster than German intelligence could track. His advances shattered defensive coherence. Units withdrew not in orderly fashion, but in fragments. The phantom had become flesh, and it was worse than imagined. German officers later wrote that once Patton was unleashed, the war in the West became uncontrollable. He did not allow defensive lines to stabilize. He did not respect the enemy's need to regroup. He attacked relentlessly, forcing retreat after retreat. The fear that had once restrained German action now accelerated their collapse. Patton's greatest weapon had never been tanks or tactics alone. It was belief. The belief that wherever he appeared, disaster followed. That belief shaped decisions long before shots were fired, and long after the battlefield had changed. By the time German commanders fully understood Patton, it was too late. The general they feared had already done his most important work, and the war's final test, the one that would define Patton forever, was still ahead. By December 1944, the war in Western Europe appeared to be tilting decisively toward the Allies. Paris was liberated. German forces were retreating. Many Allied commanders believed the enemy was exhausted, broken, and capable of large-scale offensive action. But the German High Command, driven by desperation and one final gamble, planned a counterstroke meant to shatter Allied confidence in a single blow. They chose winter bad weather and the Ardennes forest, the same terrain that had stunned France in 1940, and deep within German planning rooms, one name dominated their calculations more than any other: Patton. German generals did not fear the Allied armies as a whole. They feared response time. They feared momentum. Above all, they feared Patton's ability to move faster than logic allowed. When Hitler approved the Ardennes offensive, later known as the Battle of the Bulge, German planners believed surprise would paralyze the Allies long enough to force a negotiated peace. But there was one problem they could not solve. If Patton turned his army north quickly, the offensive would collapse. That fear proved justified. When the German attack began on December 16, 1944, it achieved tactical surprise. American units were hit hard. Lines bent and broke. Snow covered the forests. Communications faltered. Panic spread through rear air areas. To many Allied commanders, the situation felt dangerously close to catastrophe. But Patton reacted differently. He did not ask if he could respond. He asked how fast. Days before the attack even began, Patton had anticipated trouble. His intelligence officers had warned of unusual German movement. While others dismissed it as defensive reshuffling, Patton ordered contingency plans, quietly, without drama. He prepared his staff for a full army pivot, something considered nearly impossible in winter conditions. When the news arrived, Patton did not hesitate. Within hours, he summoned his commanders and issued orders that stunned everyone present. His Third Army would turn 90 degrees in snow, ice, and chaos and drive north to relieve Bastogne. No Allied army had ever attempted such a maneuver under combat conditions. Roads were frozen. Fuel was scarce. Visibility was poor. German forces stood between Patton and his objective. But Patton believed hesitation was deadlier than risk. German commanders did not believe the reports at first. Intelligence indicated Patton's forces were positioned far to the south. They assumed he would need weeks to reorganize, days at minimum. When German officers received confirmation that Patton's columns were already moving, disbelief turned to alarm. Then fear. Patton's movement shattered German assumptions. His armor pushed through narrow roads clogged with refugees and wreckage. His infantry marched through snowstorms that froze weapons and numbed limbs. Supply lines strained but held. The speed was relentless. German officers later admitted they could not understand how an entire army moved with such coordination under such conditions. On December 26th, Patton's forces broke through to Bastogne. The psychological impact was devastating. German units that had advanced with confidence now faced counterattacks they had not prepared for. The offensive timetable collapsed. German reserves were forced into defensive reactions. Momentum, the one thing Germany needed, vanished. German commanders later wrote that once Patton entered the battle, the Ardennes offensive was doomed. The fear that had once restrained German decision-making now became reality. Patton was not just aggressive, he was adaptive. He exploited hesitation instantly. He attacked where German units expected rest. He pressed forward when doctrine suggested consolidation. And he never slowed down. As winter dragged on, Patton continued pushing. German forces withdrew under pressure they could not escape. Fuel shortages worsened. Morale collapsed. Officers reported units disintegrating not from defeat, but from exhaustion and inevitability. Patton was everywhere, in reports, in rumors, in retreating columns. To German soldiers, his name became shorthand for relentless pursuit. After the war, German generals spoke openly. They respected many Allied commanders. They admired logistics, airpower, industrial strength. But Patton was different. He embodied unpredictability. He turned planning into panic. He punished delay. He made caution dangerous. One German officer summarized it bluntly. Against Patton, you never had time. That was the true source of fear. Patton did not win every battle perfectly. He made mistakes. He clashed with superiors. He offended allies. But to the enemy, none of that mattered. What mattered was this. When Patton appeared, the war accelerated, and Germany could not keep up. By early 1945, German resistance in the West was collapsing. The end was inevitable, and among German officers reflecting on defeat, one truth emerged repeatedly. The Allies had many generals. Some were careful. Some were brilliant planners. Some were masters of logistics. But only one made them afraid before the fighting even began. George Patton, not because he was cruel, not because he was reckless, but because he refused to slow down, and because he understood that war is won not just by destroying armies, but by breaking confidence. In the end, Patton was not feared because he shouted the loudest or advanced the farthest. He was feared because when others hesitated, he was already moving.